how are you? I hope you are all well. I've just spent the last 2 weeks working from home. You'd think because I'd been at home for 2 weeks, I would have spent this whole time making YouTube videos and doing all this stuff that I can't do when I'm working in an office. And of course I have not. I feel like I'm the kind of person who should love being at home, which I do a lot of the time, but I think it's just the disruption in routine that kind of throws me out a bit. It's just been very cold and wet. We've had so much rain that we've had flash flooding twice in the last 2 weeks. It just goes to show how bad our drainage system is. So anyway, I didn't make any videos, but I did read some books, so I will go through those now. I decided to reread a childhood favourite, Molly Moon's incredible book of Hypnotism by Byng. I actually did start reading this earlier in the year and kind of stopped because I was a bit disappointed in the way the villains were being described. There was very much an emphasis on villains physically looking ugly and fat, and that being like a visible sign of their inner evilness, which is definitely very much a product of its time. This book came out in 2002 and just feels super uncomfortable reading that now. But anyway, I decided to finish it because I had such good memories of reading it when I was a kid, so I kind of wanted that nostalgia hit. By the time I finished the book, I realized that like the scenes that I were remembering were actually from the second novel, I think. So now I'm gonna have to read that to actually get that nostalgia hit that I really wanted. This book is about a girl called Molly who finds a hypnotism book in her local library. She lives at an orphanage and gets bullied by the woman who runs the orphanage and the other kids there, apart from her best friend Rocky. Rocky gets adopted by these Americans, and so she is determined to use her hypnotism to fly over to America and be reunited with Rocky. I mean, this is exactly the kind of book that I loved as a kid. Children going off on their own without adults, having all kinds of adult-like adventures. There's a huge emphasis on food, which I always loved, being a great lover of food. And it's like a rags to riches story, but it's actually the girl herself who is using her own skills to go from the rags to the riches, which is a lovely take on that kind of story. I'm really curious to see how the other books in the series progress, whether the writing gets any slicker and whether the plotting gets a bit more complicated. It's definitely a good kids book, I think, aside from the whole fat-phobic aspects of the descriptions, but definitely something I enjoyed more as a child than I did as an adult. Next I finished Loveless by Alice Oseman. This is the first Alice Oseman book I've read because my library hasn't had any of her books before, but I've been keen to read her books for a long time because I've heard such good things about them, and it's always really interesting to read books by someone who's around my age as well. This was a very interesting read for me in that, in terms of the actual reading experience and the quality of the book, I thought it was okay. It was pretty middling for me, but the actual content of the book, in that the way it made me think about my own life, I knew it was something that was going to make me think a lot, but I guess it hit me a bit harder than I kind of thought it would. So this is a book about a girl who has never been in a relationship. She's just finished high school and is on her way to university. It details her first year at university with two of her best friends from high school and her new roommate. And it's basically about her realizing and discovering that she is a romantic asexual. I remember the first time I learnt about asexuality, it was actually in an article in a magazine, which is so weird to think about. This was in like 2012, but like the internet still existed then, and the fact that I learnt about something like this in traditional media is kind of funny. I remember when reading that article that it just was like a light bulb over my head. I don't think I'd ever read something before that was so much myself reflected in what I was reading, because particularly at the time I had absolutely no interest in sex whatsoever. Throughout high school I kind of thought that sex was something that adults did, and I remember being so surprised because I first went to high school when I was 14 because I homeschooled before then, and I remember being so surprised that people my age were talking about sex because, I don't know, I guess I assumed it was like alcohol and voting. You weren't allowed to do it until you're 18. Yeah, I've sort of kind of identified as asexual since then. It's not something I really go around telling people because my sort of attitude towards all those kinds of things is never say never. The idea of putting such a firm label on myself I find a bit intimidating because I can't tell what I will want to do or feel or identify with in like 10 years time, because even since I read that article, the idea of asexuality and how that might manifest itself in me has changed. But I think what was nice about this book was that it reminded me of how much asexuality is a spectrum. There are actually there's another asexual character, there's also another aromantic character. While I felt like in the book it was a little bit clunkily done in that the explanation that this character character gives to the main character Georgia about asexuality felt kind of copy and pasted from the internet. Something about reading it just made me feel more confident, perhaps identifying that way than I had before. I think this is the case for a lot of sexualities and gender identities and all that kind of thing that's different from the norm, is that if you don't fit the exact stereotype of what we think those particular things are, then we feel like we're frauds for wanting to identify that way. Interestingly, the character Georgia probably is the stereotype that we think of in regards to asexuality, in that she is sex repulsed. The thought of even kissing another person is horrifying to her, and not all asexual people feel that way about sex. I have read a few reviews online which criticize that aspect of the book and say that the book provides quite stereotyped representations of each of the sexualities that it's showing. Not just asexuality but also pansexuality, which her roommate Rudy identifies with. I definitely understand those criticisms, but as far as I remember, the book was quite explicit in saying that these were just one examples of these sexualities and that entire spectrums exist with regards to everything. I didn't find that an issue. However, I would love to read a book with an asexual character that more represents me, but I do always think the complaint that a piece of work doesn't represent all aspects of something is just an impossible one to fulfill, because nothing can represent everything, and if a story tried to do that, it would really feel like box ticking. So I think really the solution to that critique is we just need more content about those things, because that's the way you will get true variety. In regards to like the actual story and the novel itself, I thought some aspects of it was so well written, and some of the dialogue and the way the characters interacted felt incredibly naturalistic, and then other points the writing would swing completely the other way and almost feel like it was really pandering to the way that people kind of interact on the internet now, or the way people write on the internet now. I don't know if I can describe it, but I guess even with some of the references, it sometimes felt like it might date quite quickly, which I guess isn't really a problem if Alice is specifically wanting to relate to young people right now in this present moment. Maybe that's just me feeling like novels should feel more timeless. But then again, maybe this novel will be a really interesting snapshot of the way that young people kind of interact these days. I did really enjoy the characters. I really enjoyed being in their world for a little while, and then at other points I'd find myself cringing because things started to feel so much like it was ticking boxes and characters weren't necessarily acting and speaking like real life people do. So it was a very mixed bag for me in that respect. But I'm very glad that it exists because of the spotlight that it's shining on asexual and aromantic people. So next, I finished The Pursuit of Love by Nancy Mitford. This is a copy of 3 of her novels in that series, which starts with The Pursuit of Love. The second book is Love in a Cold Climate, which is the most famous one. I think because the original like BBC TV series back in the day called itself Love in a Cold Climate, even though it was about the first 2 books, I believe. I guess because it's a more interesting, catchy name. Anyway, I decided to reread these books because of the new adaptation of The Pursuit of Love, written and directed by Emily Mortimer, which stars Lily James and Emily Beecham, and has all sorts of great casts like Dominic West and Hot Priest himself, Andrew Scott. And I really wanted to reread this before I watched that, to really see how Emily Mortimer approached the adaptation, and so I could really do a proper contrast and compare kind of thing. I really enjoyed diving back into the Nancy Mitford world. She is such an incredible writer. Her writing seems so simple on the surface, but there are so many layers to what she's saying. She's telling the story from the point of view of Fanny, who goes periodically to visit her cousins, including Linda, who is her favourite, who all live in this rambling house called Alconley, and their father is slightly insane in that he'll sometimes hunt his own children, and it's all very much eccentric old English family vibes. Mitford does a kind of Gatsby thing where she gets the least interesting character to be the narrator and talk about the most interesting character, which is Linda, even though I don't find Fanny uninteresting as such, but that's the way it's presented. Fanny is the character who marries a nice man and has children and goes and lives in Oxford, and Linda is the one who is compulsively with 3 different men because she is constantly pursuing her idea of romance and love. Nancy Mitford is also so funny. There are so many little asides that absolutely did not have to be there, but she put them in anyway because they're hilarious. It also shows how women in the 1930s and 40s did not have that much choice about how they could conduct their own lives, regardless of whether they were educated or not. Fanny has gone to school and she is very well educated. Linda and her siblings have had no education education because their father finds it distasteful in a woman, and yet they are both obliged to marry men for their safety and security. So the new adaptation of this book kind of takes that particular feminist concept and really bangs you over the head with it. It's a kind of adaptation that you might have seen a few years ago, and people would have been excited about this very modern take on an older classic, but being that overt with it completely disregards the fact that Mitford was already saying these things. They were just woven more delicately and subtly into the text. I'm now reading Love in a Cold Climate. I don't remember anything that happens in this book at all, so it's actually like I'm reading it for the first time, because everything that I remember from these books has already happened in the first book, so I've absolutely no clue what's going to happen. So next I read Friends and Dark Shapes by Kavita Bedford. This is a book I got from a book sale at work. This is something they do periodically, sell off all the proof copies of books that they get sent to the newspaper. The rest of the books I bought are actually in a pile behind me over there. Normally I only find like one or two, but I think because they couldn't have a sale last year because of COVID, there's just a huge pile of books that had built up. So there was a lot to choose from, and it was very exciting because they were only $2 each. So anyway, this book is about a woman sort of in her late 20s living in a share house in Sydney in Redfern, and each chapter is really small and is like a little vignette about different aspects of her life and the people that she lives among. There's a really strong focus on the multiculturalism of Sydney and the reality of living in a city that you've grown up with but can barely afford to live in anymore. You certainly can't afford to buy your own house. Most of the characters have multiple jobs because they all have to work the gig economy, mostly because they're all like artist and writer types. I feel like if you'd never read anything about Sydney, this would be really interesting. I think it provides a really good overview of what the city is like currently. I think for me, having been to Sydney and knowing about, for example, Western Sydney is where mostly immigrants live and Northern Sydney is where all the white rich people live, I feel for me that all that stuff was kind of over-explained in this book, which is to make me wonder who it was written for, because if it was written for Sydney-siders, then it would feel just a bit over-explained, whereas if it's written for like tourists and people overseas, then you would certainly get a real insight into the geography of Sydney, that's for sure. I do feel this fits very well with the kind of writing that comes out of Sydney. It's interesting to me reading this that I'd never really thought about different cities having different kinds of writing coming out of them before, especially not in Australia. But it really had that Sydney vibe that you wouldn't get out of writing about any other city in Australia, I don't think. Yeah, I'll show you the other books that I got. Hang on. So I got 6 books in total. I got The Dutch House by Anne Patchett, which I actually got out of the library ages ago and didn't finish before I had to take it back. I don't know whether I want to read this particularly, but I thought my mum might want to read it, so I got it. I got this called The Divines by Ellie Eaton. It says on the back that it has the emotional power of normal people and the reflective haze of the girls, which sounds good because I love normal people and I did like the atmosphere of the girls. So this is about an elite boarding school and about one of the pupils sort of thinking back on her days there, I believe. This is called Everything is Beautiful by Eleanor Ray, which I may have partly bought purely because of the cool little window cover. And this one is for fans of Eleanor Oliphant is Completely Fine, which I love a good awkward female protagonist who doesn't know how to socialize with people. Got People Like Her by Ellery Lloyd, which I bought almost purely for this tagline, which says, followed by millions, hunted by one, ... It's a thriller about someone who runs a Mumstagram, apparently. So hopefully that's fun as well. And then lastly, I got Growing Up Disabled in Australia, which is edited by Carly Finlay. Apparently this is the 5th book in the Growing Up in Australia series, which I didn't realize there'd been so many already, so I'm gonna have to catch up because it sounds super interesting. And this one is a bunch of writings and also interviews with writers with a disability or a chronic illness. Alright, well thank you so much for joining me. I will see you in my next video. Bye!